What if reality isn't something we observe, but something we create? Picture a quiet laboratory buried beneath layers of concrete and secrecy. March 15, 2019. A cold, humming corridor at CERN. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, physicist and pioneer of the mind's frontier, enters Laboratory 7. Security footage captures her arrival. What it never captures is her exit. Rodriguez had spent nearly a decade crafting what she called observer theory, a radical extension of quantum mechanics. While most physicists believed observation affected particles, she believed something far bolder, that consciousness creates the very scaffolding of reality. Time, matter, energy, all of it, she theorized, springs into being through awareness. Her research was elegant, her methods rigorous. She noticed anomalies, tiny variations in physical constants depending on who was doing the observing. Statistical noise, some said, but Rodriguez found a pattern, a rhythm to the universe that seemed to hum in tune with human expectation. She began to suspect that what we believe doesn't just shape perception, it shapes the laws themselves. And then came the final experiment. On March 14th, she attempted the unthinkable, isolate a quantum system from all observation. According to her notes, these unobserved systems didn't remain suspended in ambiguity. They vanished. Reality, when unobserved, simply ceased. The following day, she disappeared as well. The lab was locked from the inside, no forced entry, no evidence of exit. Within hours, all her data was scrubbed from CERN servers. Officials claimed she took leave, but her badge never left the building. It's tempting to file her disappearance away with the other mysteries of academia. A burnout, a breakdown, a vanishing act, but that would ignore the deepest implications of her work. If consciousness truly constructs reality, then what becomes of someone who begins to edit it? Her final notes hinted at shared belief creating shared physics. That collectives could sculpt the rules of their world. It wasn't just theoretical. She had begun to prove it. What if we aren't passive participants in the universe, but architects of it? And if Rodriguez discovered how to build reality from thought, who else knew? And who decided she had seen too much? Her story is the first in a pattern, a sequence of disappearances tied not by location or nationality, but by the weight of their revelations. This journey begins with one missing scientist, but it will take us across the edges of physics, through the boundaries of death, and into the malleable heart of what we call truth. The question isn't just what they discovered, it's why they were silenced, and whether we're ready to know what they found. It began, as most scientific revolutions do, with a simple question: what if aging isn't inevitable? In the autumn quiet of Harvard's biology wing, Dr. Sarah Chen moved through her lab like a conductor. Petri dishes, genetic sequences, mice with silvered fur that shimmered with promise. September 3, 2020, the day before the world should have changed, but didn't. Chen wasn't chasing longevity. She was hunting immortality's twin, renewal. And she had found it in the unlikeliest of places, within ourselves. In what scientists had long dismissed as nature's passive erosion, Chen discovered an active program. Aging, she realized, wasn't decay, it was code, and code, as every scientist knows, can be rewritten. Her breakthrough was not just about telomeres, those tiny caps at the ends of chromosomes. She went deeper. Hidden in our DNA, she uncovered what she called the aging master switch, a genetic system that could shift cells from decline to regeneration. With precise gene therapy, she turned elderly mice into youthful versions of themselves. Muscles rebuilt, organs renewed. Even their behavior changed, as if memory itself grew young again. And then came the humans. In secret trials, volunteers age 70 regained the physiology of people half their age, or younger. Bone density, skin elasticity, heart function. But more than that, They reported feeling different, like time itself had loosened its grip. Chen was ready to go public. Her press conference was scheduled. Her findings were undeniable. Humanity stood on the threshold of rewriting its biological fate. But on the night before her announcement, she sent a final encrypted message to her colleague. "They told me not to publish. No names, just a warning. If this goes silent, don't let them erase it." That was the last anyone heard from her. Security footage shows her arriving at the lab that evening. The building logs no exit. By morning, the lab was sealed. All her notes, equipment, and backups gone. Harvard issued a statement. Dr. Chen had resigned to pursue private research, but no trail followed, just silence. What if aging isn't a natural limit, but a biological failsafe? A switch flipped by evolution or design? And what if someone out there prefers it stays that way? Because an end to aging means an end to entire industries, to power built on decay, to systems that rely on the slow erosion of human potential. Dr. Chen's disappearance echoes with possibility, not only that we might live longer, but that we were always meant to, that within us are ancient instructions for youth and vitality, waiting to be reawakened. But someone decided humanity wasn't ready to receive that message, or worse, that only a few should. Her story is a whisper from the edge of time, where death is not a necessity, but a choice, and where one woman dared to undo it, not by magic, not by myth, but by decoding the truth written into our very cells. A truth we were never supposed to receive. Imagine a mind so attuned it can read thoughts, absorb entire books in minutes, and solve equations that baffle supercomputers, all without effort. Dr. Marcus Webb believed that mind wasn't fiction. It was human potential, waiting to be unlocked. In the sleek halls of Stanford University, Webb's research was once considered fringe. He wasn't studying intelligence the traditional way. He was exploring savants, people who, after brain injury, suddenly displayed impossible abilities. Musical prodigies, mathematical geniuses, human calculators with no formal training. Accidents had turned their minds into something extraordinary, but Webb saw a pattern in the chaos. Using advanced neuroimaging, he mapped the brainwave frequencies of savants and noticed something strange. Synchronization. Regions of the brain that usually worked in isolation were firing in perfect unison. These weren't damaged brains, they were upgraded ones. So he posed a radical question. What if we could simulate those brain states, not through injury, but through science? Using precise electromagnetic stimulation, Webb began testing what he called consciousness enhancement protocols. Volunteers, regular people, began to exhibit astonishing abilities. They could recall long strings of numbers after a single glance, solve logic puzzles at blistering speeds. More eerily, some claimed they could sense the emotions, even unspoken thoughts, of those around them. Webb had tapped into something profound. He mapped the exact frequencies linked to memory, empathy, creativity, and intuition. Consciousness, it seemed, was not a vague spiritual concept, but a measurable, tunable spectrum. And the implications were seismic. His system could do more than enhance individuals. Scaled through radio towers or cell networks, it could elevate entire populations, an intellectual awakening at the flick of a switch. But intelligence breeds independence, and independence threatens control. 2 days before Webb's scheduled publication, representatives from major pharmaceutical companies visited his lab. They offered to buy his research. He refused. The next day, federal agents arrived. By nightfall, Marcus Webb was gone. Stanford claimed he left to pursue private ventures. But the lab had been stripped, his devices destroyed, servers wiped clean. The technology that could have sparked a global cognitive revolution, erased like chalk from a blackboard. Webb had discovered that human consciousness isn't fixed. It's elastic, expandable, programmable, and in doing so, he crossed an invisible line. A mind that can't be controlled is a threat. A society that sees through deception, ungovernable. So what do you do when someone hands humanity the keys to its next evolution? You take them away, quietly, permanently. Webb's disappearance wasn't just the silencing of a scientist, it was the burial of a future, one in which we might have seen, truly seen, what we're capable of. And now we're left to wonder, what could we become if we were free to grow beyond the limits imposed on us? What minds might we awaken if we dared to turn the dial ourselves? It began with a whisper in the laws of physics, a question no one dared to ask out loud. What if gravity isn't a constant, but a variable we can control? Dr. Yuki Tanaka didn't just ask the question, she answered it. In a modest lab at Tokyo University, surrounded by coils of wire and softly pulsing generators, Tanaka built machines that defied everything Newton, Einstein, and centuries of science had told us. Her work began with a suspicion that gravity and electromagnetism, long considered separate forces, were in fact intertwined in ways we hadn't yet understood. Using custom electromagnetic fields, she engineered spaces where gravity bent to her will. Objects hovered weightlessly, then reversed direction, floating upward as if untethered from Earth itself. Colleagues watched, stunned, as she created localized gravitational wells, invisible pockets that pulled objects sideways or even neutralized weight entirely. She wasn't violating physics. She was rewriting its terms. Tanaka had discovered how to manipulate what she called gravitational field lines, the hidden architecture of spacetime. Her devices could redirect these lines like currents in a stream, altering how mass interacted with the space around it. Anti-gravity wasn't theoretical anymore. It was happening in real time in her lab. The implications were breathtaking. Transportation without fuel, energy drawn from the gravity wells of planets, buildings that floated, spacecraft that leapt from Earth without rockets. Tanaka drafted designs for full-scale generators, machines capable of lifting entire cities or propelling humanity into deep space. Her vision wasn't just of science. It was liberation. And then, 3 days before her scheduled presentation to the International Physics Consortium, men in suits arrived. They claimed to represent energy stakeholders, no credentials, no affiliations, just quiet voices and urgent warnings. That night, security footage caught them entering her lab. Then, static. Cameras failed. Systems glitched. When recordings resumed hours later, Tanaka was gone. Her apparatus dismantled. Her lab stripped to bare walls. Tokyo University released a statement. Dr. Tanaka had joined a confidential government research initiative. No such program has ever been confirmed. Her notebooks, smuggled out by a former student, told a different story. She hadn't just discovered anti-gravity. She'd proven that gravity itself could be engineered, tamed like electricity. But someone decided that knowledge was too volatile. Why? Because to control gravity is to control mobility, energy, even escape itself. What happens when the governed no longer need roads, rails, or rockets? When the limits that tether us to this planet and to each other dissolve. Tanaka gave us a glimpse of a world unshackled from its weight, a world where gravity is not a law, but a choice. And then she vanished, as if pulled into the very void she sought to master. Her work remains a ghost in physics, her story a riddle written in the margins of history. And the question she left behind still echoes. If gravity can be undone, what else might be unbound? What if silence isn't emptiness, but the sound of thoughts traveling without a voice? On May 22, 2019, Dr. Robert Hayes was hours away from publishing a study that could have altered human communication forever. And then, just like that, he was gone. Hayes wasn't a mystic. He was a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins, armed with data, instruments, and skepticism. But what he found went far beyond skepticism. It cracked open the door to a hidden ability we've carried all along: telepathy. For centuries, mind reading was the stuff of fiction and fringe belief. Hayes thought so too, until he discovered that the brain emits electromagnetic signals more nuanced than we'd ever imagined. These signals weren't random static. They were structured, encoded, carrying emotional states, images, even thoughts. Under normal conditions, these neural broadcasts are too faint to be perceived, but Hayes engineered a way to amplify them. Using paired volunteers, isolated in separate shielded rooms, he demonstrated something extraordinary. When one participant viewed a set of images, the other could accurately describe them, without ever seeing them. No sound, no signal, just pure thought-to-thought transfer. It went further. Emotions could be transmitted, memories could be shared, and most astonishingly, the receivers didn't just observe the thoughts. They felt them, as if they were their own. Hayes had discovered that our brains were built not just to process the world, but to connect directly with each other. He mapped frequencies linked to different mental content, one for visuals, another for emotions, others still for abstract reasoning. By isolating and boosting these frequencies, Hayes enabled controllable two-way mind-to-mind communication. And then came the darker realization. This wasn't just communication. It was surveillance. His system could read thoughts, not guesses, not inferences, but actual internal monologues. With miniaturization, Hayes foresaw a device no larger than a phone, capable of eavesdropping on the human mind from a distance. The intelligence community took notice. Within days of his final testing phase, Hayes expressed hesitation. He worried the tech would be weaponized, used not for understanding, but control. He was last seen leaving his lab the night before his paper was to be published. Cameras caught him stepping into the corridor. He never made it home. By morning, his lab was cleared. His notes, devices, and backups all erased. University servers scrubbed. His project listed as inactive. The official story? Hayes had taken an indefinite leave. But those close to him knew better. His research threatened not just privacy, but the very idea of internal freedom. What happens when your thoughts are no longer your own? When inner silence becomes a public space? Dr. Hayes stood at the edge of a new era, one where understanding each other might have transcended language, culture, even conflict. But instead, his voice was silenced. And we're left to wonder, in a world where thoughts can be heard, who decides what remains unspoken? It started with a paradox, tucked inside the strange world of quantum physics. What if the future can change the past? Dr. Lisa Morrison didn't believe in time travel. At least not the kind from science fiction. No glowing machines, no spinning DeLoreans. But she believed in quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics hinted at something even stranger. That observation in the present could ripple backward, rewriting what had already happened. Her lab at MIT wasn't filled with clocks. It was filled with probabilities. Morrison had been studying the quantum eraser experiment, a mind-bending phenomenon where decisions made in the present seemed to alter outcomes in the past. It was more than a curiosity. To Morrison, it was a signal. Time, as we understood it, was not a one-way street. She developed what she called temporal resonance fields, zones where consciousness could interact with its own past through entangled quantum systems. Not physical time travel, but informational. A way for the mind to send messages to its earlier self. The results were surreal. Random number generators would shift based on future intent. Data logs changed retroactively to match what Morrison focused on in the present. Events twisted themselves into new shapes, aligning with knowledge not yet acquired. She wasn't imagining it. Her colleagues saw the patterns too. And then came the impossible. Morrison began receiving information from herself. Notes she claimed were from her future consciousness. Predictions, warnings, hints about events that hadn't happened yet, but would. She wrote down outcomes of stock markets, political shifts, scientific breakthroughs. Many came true. She had opened a feedback loop in time, a whispering line between now and then, and it terrified her, because if she could influence the past, so could anyone else. History could be rewritten, records changed, mistakes erased. At what point would reality stop being history and become an ongoing edit? Her notebooks became more urgent. She feared what governments might do with the technology, what power-hungry institutions might rewrite, not just documents, but identities, revolutions, truths. And then, the night before she was scheduled to demonstrate her findings to military observers, she vanished. MIT claimed she'd accepted a position in a classified program, but her lab was cleared overnight. Equipment dismantled. Footage corrupted by electromagnetic interference. Not even a pen was left behind. Morrison had cracked the chronology of reality, but someone had decided the clock should stop. Her disappearance wasn't just a loss, it was a reset. Because if the past is malleable, so is accountability. So is memory. So is identity itself. What happens when time becomes an editable file? And who gets to hold the cursor? Dr. Morrison left behind no trace. But the questions she raised now live in the shadows of every historical fact. And in the silence where cause and effect used to be, we hear something strange, the future echoing backwards. He wasn't looking for secrets, he was decoding silence. Dr. Kevin Park, geneticist at the University of California, didn't believe in destiny, at least not the kind written in stars. But he believed in the code written inside us. DNA, the spiral staircase of life. For decades, scientists dismissed the vast majority of our DNA as junk, evolutionary leftovers with no apparent function. Park disagreed. He believed that within the 98% of non-coding sequences lay something profound, not waste, but hidden architecture. He was right. Using advanced machine learning and pattern recognition, Park uncovered what looked less like biology and more like software. Complex commands, recursive loops, if-then structures. It wasn't just language. It was instruction, programming embedded in our genes, and more astonishingly, it could be rewritten. Park called it the genetic operating system. Within it, he identified clusters that influenced memory, intuition, intelligence, even perception. By developing targeted gene therapy, he began modifying these dormant codes in volunteers. The results were nothing short of mythical. Subjects exhibited rapid cognitive growth, IQ spikes of 40 to 60 points, eidetic memory, emotional resilience. Some began to anticipate events before they occurred, accurately predicting random sequences, sensing danger before it arrived. One participant claimed they could feel electricity before touching a light switch. Another influenced electronic devices with thought alone. Park had unlocked latent capabilities buried deep in the double helix, abilities science had long dismissed as paranormal. But this wasn't magic. It was math. His breakthrough suggested that normal human limitations weren't natural, they were programmed. Our potential wasn't absent, it was gated. And Park had found the master key. His notes detailed protocols for global genetic upgrades, therapies that could be administered like vaccines, lifting the entire species into a new evolutionary tier. Disease, decay, cognitive limits, all rendered obsolete by a few lines of edited code. But not everyone saw progress. Military contractors and biotech firms circled his lab like vultures. They didn't want evolution. They wanted control, super soldiers, cognitive elites, designer humans for strategic advantage. Park resisted. He feared a future where enhancement was privilege, not right. A world of genetic caste, where the upgraded ruled and the unmodified obeyed. On the evening of October 4, 2019, he worked late. Security cameras recorded him alone, reviewing data. The footage ends there. He was never seen again. By dawn, his research had vanished, servers wiped, devices seized. The university claimed he'd accepted a role at a private biotech firm. No trace of such a company exists. Park's discoveries suggested that we are not at the end of our evolution, but at the beginning of something vast, something we were never meant to find alone. Because if our DNA contains buried programs, who wrote them? And who decided to hide them? His disappearance wasn't the end of a project. It was the silencing of a mirror held up to our species. A mirror that whispered, "You were always more than this." It began with a flicker, a shimmer in the corner of perception. Not a hallucination, not imagination, but a tear in the fabric of what we call real. Dr. Ahmed Hassan didn't believe in parallel worlds. He proved them. At Cambridge University, Hassan's research into quantum mechanics took him into the dense forest of the many worlds theory. The idea that every decision spawns a new universe, a place where different outcomes unfold, forever beyond our reach. But Hassan wanted to reach them. Using entangled quantum systems and controlled measurement cascades, he developed what he called dimensional resonance technology, machinery capable of detecting and eventually accessing these alternate realities. At first, he observed microscopic shifts, patterns that shouldn't exist, glimpses of outcomes that diverged from known inputs. Then came the breakthrough. He created apertures, small at first, but real. He could see through to other versions of his own laboratory, and they weren't empty. In those labs, he saw himself, alternate versions of Dr. Hassan working on identical machines, sharing notes, refining theories. They began to communicate across realities. What followed was a collaboration unlike any in human history. Knowledge flowed between dimensions. Hassan retrieved materials unknown to our periodic table, documents describing historical events that never happened here, and technology decades ahead of our own. But not all realities were hopeful. In some, Earth had suffered catastrophe, nuclear fire, ecological collapse, pandemics that erased nations. Hassan documented them all as warnings. And yet, in others, he found what humanity has always longed for: cures, clean energy, peaceful societies with enhanced cognition and deeper empathy. It was all there, somewhere else. The implications shattered every boundary. Dimensional engineering could solve any problem by importing the solution from a reality where it had already been solved. But solutions are also weapons. Governments took notice. On December 18, 2020, Hassan was finalizing a full-scale portal, large enough for human passage. Security footage caught an electromagnetic surge, a flash of white so bright it blinded the cameras. When the systems recovered, the lab was in ruins. No Hassan, no gateway, no trace. Cambridge issued a vague statement. Dr. Hassan had transferred to a classified project. But former colleagues described a scene of quiet panic. The smell of scorched metal, the eerie hum of something that had been opened and closed. Some believe he stepped through. Others think he was removed before he could invite the world in. Because to open a door is to challenge the walls built to contain us. Hassan proved we are not alone, not in space, but in truth. Infinite versions of us walk parallel paths, some wiser, some darker, all real. But if knowledge can cross between worlds, so can fear, so can control. And perhaps that's why his lab was silenced, not because he failed, but because he succeeded. Because if you could choose another world, would you still obey the rules of this one, or would you walk through the doorway and never come back? She didn't seek to conquer death. She simply refused to believe it was the end. Dr. Maria Santos, neuroscientist at Stanford University, had spent years studying the boundary between life and what follows, not with mysticism or seances, but with instruments, sensors, and data. Her work was rooted in the clinical, the observable, yet what she found was something most would never dare to quantify: consciousness beyond the body. It began with near-death experiences, those fleeting electric moments when the heart stops but the mind keeps going. Using advanced neuromonitoring during cardiac arrest, Santos recorded patterns that shouldn't have existed. Organized brain-like activity continued minutes after all biological signs had ceased. She compared the brain to a receiver, not a source, like a radio picking up a signal that still exists even if the device is smashed. Then she found the signal. Her lab developed specialized detectors that could identify electromagnetic patterns associated with conscious thought, not just in the living, but in the recently deceased. These weren't random flickers. They were structured, purposeful responses. She had opened a channel. Santos created modulation systems to send messages, simple prompts at first, and what came back changed everything. Coherent replies, memories, names, descriptions of post-death existence that defied belief, yet carried the unmistakable signature of identity. The deceased weren't echoes, they were present. Her communications described dimensions of thought where time unraveled, where consciousness shaped its surroundings like clay. Places of instant travel, of merged awareness, of knowledge beyond language. And those voices, those minds, had stories to tell, including breakthroughs and discoveries they'd made after death, insights into physics, biology, even ethics. Some described continued research, others spoke of reunions. Many simply urged her, keep going, you're close. Santos began to build a database, Conversations with the Dead, a library of human knowledge that extended beyond mortality. She envisioned a future where death didn't divide, but connected, where grief was no longer final, families speaking across the veil, lost wisdom recovered, a bridge between the living and the departed. But not everyone welcomed that bridge. Religious institutions bristled, governments grew nervous. What would society become if death was proven to be not an end, but a shift? Control depends on finality. On July 31st, 2021, hours before she was to present her findings to a global neuroscience summit, Santos vanished. Stanford claimed she took a sabbatical, but her lab was sealed by federal authorities, her servers dismantled, her data confiscated. The detectors she built erased from inventory. Only fragments remain, stray recordings, smuggled notes, half-coded transcripts of conversations with minds no longer tethered to bodies. She had offered a radical gift, the chance to redefine existence. But someone decided the dead should remain silent. And so we are left with the question that haunted Santos until the end. If consciousness doesn't die, then what are we really? And who decides which voices are heard and which are buried beneath the silence? What if the universe isn't built from atoms, but from code? Dr. James Wright, a theoretical physicist at MIT, had a suspicion. Not a hunch, a pattern. A whisper beneath the laws of nature, where quantum mechanics and computer science seem to speak the same language. Superposition resembled parallel processing. Collapse resembled execution. The universe, he thought, didn't act like a machine. It acted like software. And what do you do with software? You learn to reprogram it. Wright called it reality source code, the foundational instructions beneath time, space, matter, not metaphor, not poetry, literal code. He believed that what we perceive as physical laws, gravity, electromagnetism, light, were just the outputs of a deeper information system. And through quantum computation and meditation-based interfaces, he found a way in. His lab became a testing ground for edited physics. He could alter local gravity, shift the speed of light, even rewrite atomic behavior, all within controlled quantum systems. Colleagues saw it with their own eyes. Small zones where reality bent and obeyed new rules, uploaded by thought and quantum machinery working in harmony. Wright had discovered administrative access to the universe. Through his neural quantum interface, human consciousness became a programming tool. Thoughts, when focused correctly, could send commands into the structure of reality itself. It was the ultimate act of creation or destruction. He envisioned user interfaces where anyone could edit the world around them. Want to pause time? Imagine it. Want to walk through walls? Upload the change. Want to heal a wound? Rewrite the body's code. It wasn't a fantasy. He had done it, on a small scale. The prototypes worked. The laws of physics weren't law. They were defaults. And then came the offers. Government officials, military observers, corporations whose products would become obsolete overnight, all wanted in. Wright hesitated. He understood the weight of what he held. He told colleagues, if this gets out, civilization won't evolve. It will fracture. On February 13, 2022, he prepared for a final demonstration, the first large-scale test of global physics modification. That night, the lab went dark. Security footage showed brief flashes of distortion, pixels warping, light behaving like fluid. Then static. When cameras resumed, the room was spotless. No machines, no Wright, just a hum in the wires. MIT stated he had accepted a role in a government think tank. But the room had been wiped clean, down to the molecular level. Dr. James Wright didn't break the laws of physics. He deleted them, or at least proved they could be. And now we are left in a world where the floor beneath our feet may not be as solid as we believe. Because if reality is code, someone, somewhere, holds the keyboard. And if that someone disappears, what happens to the script they were about to write? What version of the world were we denied by the erasure of one man who learned to edit existence itself? Some stories don't end with a missing person. They begin with one. Each of these scientists vanished under mysterious circumstances, but their discoveries trace the outline of a larger question. What connects them? They came from different fields: physics, biology, neuroscience, genetics. Yet every one of them made breakthroughs that pointed in a single, startling direction. That reality, and humanity's place in it, is far more malleable than we've been told. They discovered that consciousness doesn't just observe, it constructs. That death is not a wall, but a doorway. That gravity, time, thought, and even DNA can be rewritten like lines in a script. They found ways to alter the script, and then, one by one, they disappeared. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded. Each story alone could be dismissed as coincidence. A burnout, a retreat into secrecy, a shift to private industry. But patterns tell deeper truths, and the pattern here is unmistakable. Every time knowledge approached the edge of control, it vanished. Data was wiped, labs cleared, the public narrative swiftly sewn up. Institutions issued quiet statements. No further questions. But the echoes remain. What binds these scientists isn't just their brilliance. It's what their work threatened. Imagine a world where aging can be reversed, thought can be shared, death isn't the end, and the laws of physics can be updated like an app. Now imagine the systems of power, economic, political, ideological, that depend on those limits being absolute. Then ask, what happens when someone dares to lift the veil? Control resists chaos. And truth, when it unravels the architecture of power, becomes dangerous. These scientists weren't eliminated because they were wrong. They were erased because they were right. We are taught that progress is slow, that discovery comes in increments. But what if the greatest leaps are not lost, but hidden? What if the ceiling of human potential was shattered years ago, and the world that would have followed was quietly locked away? There's no proof, only fragments, smuggled notes, brief anomalies, the absence of people who should still be speaking, and the lingering sense that the universe we're living in is smaller than it should be. What remains is not certainty, but a question. If these brilliant minds had changed the world, would we ever have been allowed to know? And more haunting still, what if they did change it, and we're already living in a version rewritten by those who took their place? He was the final puzzle piece, the quiet anomaly that tied all the others together. Dr. Elias Monroe wasn't famous. He didn't have TED Talks or best-selling books, but within a small circle of interdisciplinary researchers, he was known as a synthesizer, someone who could take the fragments of different fields and see the patterns hidden between them. Monroe had no lab of his own, no grand theory, just a question he pursued obsessively. Why do certain types of discovery vanish? He noticed the disappearances, not just of the scientists, but of their ideas. Patents retracted, papers pulled, data sets deleted. He began to track them, a growing constellation of missing minds, each connected by the nature of what they were trying to prove. He saw the common thread long before anyone else. Each of the 10 scientists we've followed had challenged an invisible perimeter, the belief that reality is fixed, that death is final, that human potential has a ceiling. Monroe believed that these weren't separate breakthroughs, they were converging vectors, different doorways leading to the same deeper truth, that existence itself is participatory, modifiable, and governed by consciousness. He started publishing under pseudonyms, anonymous essays on obscure forums and encrypted networks. The pieces were cautious, speculative, but brilliant. One essay posited that consciousness, DNA, physical law, and even space-time were all expressions of the same underlying code, and that some humans were rediscovering how to write it. Another argued that ancient myths about gods, prophets, and ascended beings were symbolic memories of past civilizations that had unlocked the same capabilities now being rediscovered and reburied. Then, in one of his final transmissions, Monroe warned of a pattern. He described a containment protocol, not official, not documented, but real. A process by which knowledge that threatens systemic control is quietly intercepted, redirected, or erased, not with violence, with silence. He named it the forgetting machine. According to Monroe, when discoveries reach a certain threshold, the threshold of transformative power, they trigger attention from unseen custodians, not to develop the breakthroughs, but to dissolve them, to ensure that civilization evolves along predictable, manageable lines, and then nothing. Monroe's digital presence vanished. His contacts received no reply. His apartment was found undisturbed, but his notebooks were gone, his hard drives wiped clean. There was no investigation, because officially there was no crime, just another quiet exit. Another piece removed from the board, but in his final message, Monroe left a line that still circulates in the corners of encrypted networks. If you ever wonder why the world feels smaller than it should, remember this: the impossible isn't rare. It's just hidden, and those who find it don't stay visible for long. His words feel less like a warning and more like an invitation, not to believe blindly, but to look deeper, to ask what else has been lost, and who benefits when truth disappears. Because if Monroe was right, the stories we've heard aren't mysteries, they're messages from the edge of a reality that was almost ours. There's a peculiar quiet that follows when a voice goes missing, not just from a room, but from history. 10 scientists, 10 revelations, and a world that moved on as if nothing had changed. But what if something did change? Not outside, but underneath. Their work touched the primal architecture of reality: time, thought, identity, mortality. Each discovery was a chisel against the stone of certainty. And with each vanished mind, we lost more than a person. We lost the version of ourselves they might have helped us become. The reverse of progress isn't destruction, it's forgetting. Dr. Elena Rodriguez showed us that reality might be shaped by attention, that the universe listens to belief. Sarah Chen proved aging could be rewritten, not halted but reversed. Marcus Webb unlocked the possibility of collective evolution through enhanced cognition. Yuki Tanaka dismantled gravity. Robert Hayes unsealed the quiet doors of telepathy. Lisa Morrison turned time into a dialogue, not a direction. Kevin Park decoded our genetic chains. Ahmed Hassan opened the windows between worlds. Maria Santos redefined death as transition, not end. James Wright offered the tools to rewrite the very laws of being, and Elias Monroe connected the map. But none of this lives in textbooks, because to rewrite what we know, to truly rewrite it, threatens the structures built upon the old story. The institutions, the hierarchies, the power drawn from telling us we are limited, breakable, alone, aging, entropy, isolation, death, we're taught they are immutable facts. But what if they're permissions we've inherited? Agreements we never consciously signed? The silence surrounding these scientists isn't accidental. It's instructive. It teaches us what not to ask, what not to pursue. Yet their echoes persist. In files recovered, in whispers online, in the intuitive certainty some of us feel that this world, this life, is not the full version, that something greater hums just beneath the surface. Not utopia, not fantasy, just truth, stranger and more beautiful than we've been led to believe. They were dreamers, yes, but they were also scientists, engineers, empiricists, and perhaps, in their absence, they left behind something more powerful than equations, a direction. Not a map, but a compass, pointing toward the horizon of human potential, inviting us to continue what they began, not by resurrecting their work, but by believing, deeply, stubbornly, that the limits we see are not the limits that are real. That discovery isn't finished. It's only sleeping, waiting for someone, maybe anyone, to remember that we were meant for more. We began with a question. What if the people who vanished weren't just lost, but erased? Now we end with something deeper. Not an answer, but a reflection. Across 14 chapters, we followed the shadows of minds who walked to the very edge of understanding. They didn't chase fame. They weren't out to break the world. They simply asked different questions, the kind that bend the boundaries of science, and in doing so, threaten the scaffolding of power. Each scientist uncovered a fragment of a greater pattern, not a conspiracy, not a coordinated plan, but a reaction, like the body's immune system rejecting what it doesn't understand. Their discoveries showed us that aging can be optional. That consciousness might outlive the brain. That time flows both ways. That reality is programmable. That we are perhaps far more powerful than we've dared to imagine. But every revelation came with a price. Erasure, not just of the person, but of the idea. Their work didn't go viral. It went silent, as if some unseen editor crossed it out from the margins of our reality, leaving only faint traces for the curious to find. So what now? What do we do with the weight of these disappearances? With the possibility that humanity has already glimpsed its next chapter and quietly turned away? Maybe it begins with a shift, not in technology, but in awareness. Because even without the labs, the prototypes, the equations, the pattern is still here, etched into our questions, whispered in the limits we're told not to test. History is not a straight line. It loops, it forgets, it hides what it cannot yet hold, but truth doesn't vanish. It waits. In locked drawers, in encrypted notes, in stories too strange to be fiction, and too consistent to ignore. This isn't a call to revolution. It's an invitation to remember, to ask harder questions, to listen more closely, to notice when silence arrives where discovery should be, and to wonder if 10 minds working alone could each change the course of history. What might happen if more of us stopped waiting for permission? What world could we create if we too chose not to look away? Perhaps that's the true legacy of these missing scientists. Not their erasure, but the door they left ajar, and the quiet, resonant possibility that everything we know can be rewritten